Is Illari the strongest support we've seen added to Overwatch 2? Honestly, I think she might be. Her combination of primary and secondary fire allow for her to farm some super high impact output. Her primary fire consists of a hit scan burst that deals up to 75 damage every second, and the secondary fire produces an insane 120 healing per second beam. For context, the hero that comes closest to this in healing output is Ana, who only generates up to 87.5 healing per second if you hit every single shot. Even Bap and Kiriko only heal up to around 77 health per second, so it's safe to say Illari's beam is pretty strong. However, there are a few key drawbacks to it. Firstly, you have to be super close to your teammates to use it, as it only has a 15-meter range. Secondly, there is a pretty strict cooldown to it. You can output up to 360 healing by holding this beam down for its full 3 seconds, but this does come with a 3.36 recharge time. The optimal play here is to cut it short just before running out of juice, and allowing it to regenerate for the remaining 2.9 seconds, saving you almost half a second in added reload time. That may not sound like much, but in these moments where allies need a lot of healing, it can be make or break to have full healing back up half a second quicker. Finally, Illari's healing also stops her from charging up her primary fire. Her primary fire charge meter charges to full every 1 second for a maximum output of 75 damage. This 1 second build up paired with her 2.9 second healing build up allows her to fit in 3 fully charged shots before unleashing her healing beam. This consistent tempo allows for her most effective output, but is definitely situational in my opinion. This tempo works best in the mid fight, where you can fully unload your healing beam on a consistent basis. Before or after fights, this tempo doesn't really mean much, as you'll rarely be fully depleting this healing bar. Consistently playing like this will allow you to mitigate the charging time of her weapons, but this tempo comes at a much lower priority than the tempos of Baptiste and Kiriko. Her primary fire also comes with a few interesting drawbacks. The charge meter will fully reset when you reload, it will pause when you press melee, and it only deals 1.5 times on a headshot for a total of 112.5 damage. Overall, both her primary and secondary fire have some insane numbers behind them, but managing her charge up times will be key to utilizing these most effectively. On the topic of numbers, let's talk about her alternative form of healing, her healing pylon. This little pylon outputs an impressive 50 healing per second, which is just less than having a Mercy perma healing you, so it's pretty effective. This is confirmed to be getting a change before Illari releases into comp, so I imagine this healing output will probably be how they lower her current power level. The pylon actually targets the lowest percentage health ally in range. This means that it doesn't care about the amount of health you're sitting at, it will just target whoever is at the lowest percentage of their maximum health pool. For example, if your Roadhog is at 300 HP and your Genji is at 100 HP, it will send 2 healing shots to the Roadhog first before it starts healing the Genji. Talking of healing shots, these can actually be blocked by shields, matrixes, deflections, and even amplified by Baptiste Matrix. Her percentage priority and block quirks are minor, but are worth noting in some niche situations. The most important thing to consider when using Illari's healing pylon is its placement. You want to be using this ability as soon as your team engages in a fight, and satisfying 2 key conditions with where you place it. Obviously, it must be within your team's line of sight to provide them with healing. But secondly, it should also be placed outside of enemy line of sight so they can't destroy it without disrupting their own positioning. This either gains you a massive advantage in terms of raw healing output, or in terms of forcing the enemy to engage closer to destroy it. I also like this ability when you're in one-on-one situations. Having a constant 50 healing per second beam on you is stupidly powerful, and allows Illari to take on most of the cast in isolated situations. Just remember that you have no real escape from most of these situations if things go wrong, so you don't want to go flanking too hard with this hero. When enemies do decide to engage closer, Illari has one ability that can help her combat them, her Outburst. This is likely her most underwhelming feature, but it can be useful in a number of scenarios. This ability deals 10 damage and a slight knockback to enemies, and allows Illari to launch in a single direction. This direction is determined by your inputs. You can hold W, A, S, or D to control the direction you launch, and spacebar to give yourself some upward momentum. You mainly want to use this for reaching high grounds that heroes like Ana usually have to walk around to, or you can save it for use against enemies who get into your face. This is really her only survivability tool, so do use it carefully. Honestly, this ability does feel a little bit underwhelming right now, and I'd love to see this reworked to potentially give her some self-healing to improve her overall survivability. Outburst is definitely the weakest part of her kit right now, but I don't even think we've spoken about her strongest part yet, which I believe to be her Captive Sun ultimate ability. This ult is a messy kind of complex, so let me break it down the best I can. Using Captive Sun grants Illari with 4 seconds of free flight and 1 Captive Sun projectile. This projectile will cause a massive 8-meter area of effect explosion that deals 50 damage when it lands. Any player tagged by the projectile or its explosion will then become sunstruck. Sunstruck is a brand new debuff that lasts 7 seconds. It causes a slow effect and deals 120 damage if you take 90 damage from any source in that 7-second window. Your teammates can contribute to this 90 damage, but as Illari, you only need one headshot or a body shot plus melee to detonate Sunstruck. The best part about this is that Sunstruck's 120 damage is splash damage, allowing it to detonate other nearby Sunstruck targets. This causes the best strategy for using Captive Sun to be focused around finding moments where enemies are grouped close together. A Captive Sun paired with a Graviton Surge, for example, may just be one of the best ultimate combos in the entire game. With that being said, there are a ton of counters to Illari's Captive Sun. For starters, this projectile can be eaten by the likes of D.Va and even be deflected back into Illari by the likes of Genji. For some reason, the hitbox on this projectile is massive, so heroes like D.Va actually become a really consistent counter to her ultimate. However, enemy shields can actually not block this projectile. Captive Sun will pass right through enemy shields and hit the enemies behind, making this ultimate actually really effective when enemies are grouped closely together behind their tank shield. Illari can, however, be stunned or hacked out of Captive Sun and lose her projectile entirely, so a well-timed Orisa Spear or Sombra hack will fully counter her ultimate. Kiriko Cleanse and other cleansing movement abilities act as consistent counters too, but you do have to be early on this. If you cleanse before the 90 damage is dealt, the Sunstruck effect will disappear entirely. However, if the 90 damage is applied before the cleanse, the explosion damage will hang around and detonate after 0.8 seconds. This usually isn't a problem if you're using an invulnerability cooldown anyway, but it is worth noting to not damage nearby teammates. Illari's Captive Sun is another ability that is confirmed to receiving a nerf, but I imagine it will just be a tweak of the numbers here as well. Illari's playstyle will focus around keeping within a close proximity of her teammates to make the most of her healing beam. Keeping her teammates close by also suits her kit due to her being relatively defenseless against divers. Having teammates around her will make her less susceptible to oncoming attackers, whilst allowing her to utilize her healing beam for insane value. Illari is great at taking up the backline position in brawl or poke style compositions. Since her damage is hit scan, it has a fall off at long ranges, so sitting behind her team and poking enemies from mid-range is her ideal placement. As both brawl and poke compositions like to engage and complete fights in a relatively stable position, this also allows her healing pylon to achieve great value here too. She'll likely perform better on close range maps, and maybe even have a performance buff in game modes like Control, where her pylon won't really need to move too far away from the point. In my opinion, I definitely see her current kit allowing her to be a main healer. This means that her primary focus should be on replenishing her teammates' resources should they be low, whilst mixing in a relatively high damage output with the 3-shot tempo that we discussed earlier. Her best synergies will likely come with any of the off healers. I think that Brig will pair with Illari particularly well to supplement her current lack of survivability, but I can totally see Lucio, Mercy, and Zenyatta pairing nicely with her as well. I think a weaker support pairing will likely come with Baptiste or Kiriko, as these pairings will almost step on each other's toes with their insane healing and even damage outputs. As for tank, I like most of the non-dive style tanks with her, but especially Zarya. Zarya and Illari both share the short beam length of 15 meters, which is just enough to allow them to keep a decent distance from enemies while still brawling. Zarya's bubbles serve as a valuable option for keeping Illari safe from dive attacks as well. That's also not to mention their insane synergy when it comes to their ultimates. I think her weakest tank pairings come with the dive tanks, as she doesn't have the range or movement to keep up with healing them a lot of the time. These tanks will also often play away from her pylon, so a lot of Illari's strengths are mitigated when your tank is off in Narnia. As Mark Walker 3510 rightfully commented last video, survival and positioning are probably the two most important skills behind mastering any support hero. So if you want to see what former rank number 1 Samito taught me about positioning, you can check out the video on the left of your screen now.